Hi, my name is Winka Doeldam. I'm the chair of the Department of Architecture at Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. I am super happy to welcome you tonight to the Jeffrey Fine and Andrea Katz lecture with Felecia Davis for her lecture Seams, Crafting and Architecture. A little bit of an introduction of our sponsors who have been so generous to support us over all these years. Jeffrey Fines is the founding partner of Pierre Fine Associates, an architectural firm which since its inception in 1983 has been involved in a wide range of projects, including residences, corporate offices, retail stores, multi-family apartments, as well as academic and government buildings. They have been architects for renovation and preservation of several properties and very important national historical landmarks. Their work has been shown in numerous architectural publications. Jeffrey Fine is also a registered architect in New York and in New Jersey. He's a member of the American Institute of Architects and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and has been a visiting juror at Columbia University in the City College of New York. He graduated, however, from the University of Pennsylvania with a Bachelor's of Arts in the DOE. We were just actually reminiscing about that in 1976, and has a Master's of Architecture, also from Penn in 78. He has served in his undergraduate class gift committee and chaired his 25th graduate class union. Jeffrey Fines has also been a member of the fundraising committee at the Children's Storefront School in New York City and is actively involved with the Johns Hopkins University, where he has served on the Hopkins Parents Council and Parent Internship Network. He lives in New York City with his wife, Andrea Katz, who is an ophthalmologist. I now give the word to Annette Fierro, who will further introduce our guest, Felecia Davis. Annette, you're mute.
Sorry. What do you want, Brick? The aphorism of this school, our school, has always suggested that material has a voice. That voice of material can give logic, that it can prompt space, can hold meaning, can engender the interaction of human beings with each other. What can a room say? What can a fabric say? The work of Felecia Davis through advancing technologies takes this potential to a literal level. Working as director of SOFTLAB at Penn State and as associate professor in the Stuckeman Center for Design, Felecia has put forward the idea that through computation involving sensors and microcontrollers, textiles can become responsive interfaces in communicating stories, in registering emotions, in transforming how we socialize in space. Her forthcoming book, Soft Built, Networked Architectural Textiles, will tell us all about this. But in this challenge to communication, we are indeed very fortunate to have her own voice telling us about this tonight. In addition to founding her own firm, the Felecia Davis Studio, which has placed as a finalist in several architectural competitions, she is also a founding member and executive officer of the Black Reconstructive Collective, which explores and funds creative work about the Black diaspora. And although she has a PhD from the Design and Computation Work Studio at MIT, and was featured in the PBS series on Women in Science Profiles, she believes in the capacity and culture of the hand in making and thinking through computational materials. In her installation at the groundbreaking MoMA exhibit last year on architecture and Blackness in America, Professor Davis gives a disenfranchised neighborhood the opportunity to tell its own story, literally in the space of the gallery, providing the word network double and triple entendre. Professor Davis has taught internationally in the Swedish School of Textiles, at MIT's Media Lab, at Cornell for 10 years, Princeton, and Cooper Union before taking a position at Penn State. In shifting between the radically different topics, uniting vital social dimensions with material and computational technologies, Professor Davis's work is an example to us all, especially now, here. Our work never has to be of only one dimension. It can exist and flourish and inform many different worlds. It is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Felecia Davis.
I'll share my screen here. Thank you so much, Chair Double Dam, for the invitation to come share my work with you all tonight at the Weitzman School of Design. And thank you, Annette, for that incredible introduction, as well as that piece that you have behind you, which really surprised me, which is one of the pieces we call mirrored textile mirror, which shows emotion. So thank you for the warm welcome. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and looking forward to new friendships. So tonight I'm going to present to you some work that has started from way back when, and also work that has just been completed last spring. And it really talks about the path that one walks as a Black architect or designer, which has many seams or places that one improvises and stitches together to make a story or really understand where one is in the world and how to make sense of things that cannot under any circumstances make any sense and never did. So there are many gaps and lacunae that are bridged by these seams. And I found these places of creativity and ways of making that allows for the investigation of fragments from the past, but also a way to project a future. As many of you know, my lab, SOFTLAB at PSU and the Stuckeman Center for Design Computing, or the SCDC, we work on computational textiles, which are textiles that respond to their environment via programming, embedded sensors, and electronics, in addition to using responses from the natural properties of fibers, where the response is used by the designer to communicate some type of information to people. And communication in our lab for our purposes means the sending of an intentional message or information through an aesthetic expression. The roles of textiles in building are quite interesting, going all the way back to Semper. We look at using textiles not only to make lightweight buildings, but also how a textile can communicate, or textile thinking can communicate in an environment. So I'd like to show you tonight some of the entanglements, so to speak, of working with textiles, computation, and soft materials. I find that the material itself shapes a way of thinking and working that leads to considering architecture and its practices in a different way. And I would say my lab has been working towards an understanding of a soft system, which thus far to us is a system that accounts for and accommodates a technological system that can register design in relation to specific bodies in specific places engaging in social, cultural, and political constructions. So this evening, I'm going to share with you 4 projects, which are a preamble from back in the 90s, a quilt, an antenna, and a new project that reveals some of the seams in my work that are areas of investigation in SOFTLAB. Let's see if I can get this to go forward there. So the first project that I'd like to share is that preamble project. It's a design for the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. And this was a thesis project way back in 1993 that propelled me to look more closely at the relationship between architecture and textiles. It was done a long time ago, maybe before many of you were born, but it still is resonating in the work that I do. And so I keep dipping back into it as this deep well of kind of knowledge that I can pull forward and really project a kind of other future for being African American and being in architecture. Leslie Loco has covered this project in her book, White Paper, Black Marks, which was an extraordinary contribution back then, maybe the later part of the 90s, but we are all still dipping into to project. So the burial ground was unearthed while digging the foundations of a 34-story federal office tower at the corners of Duane Street and Lower Broadway in Manhattan. While they were digging, they brought up skeletons, bits of coffins, and other artifacts of the old and forgotten slave burial ground outside the Dutch walls that occupied the space that's now known as Wall Street. Construction was halted and a full archaeological dig was held. And so really, the project that I did for thesis recovered sacred grounds and revealed new information about the people who were buried there by archaeological cataloging. A source of inspiration was from African funerals. In this case, this is a figure titled Kalabari Funerals, Celebration and Display, and it's from African Arts, Volume 21, 1988. So it's important to note at this time, back then, I'd not been to sub-Saharan Africa. I'd been to the northern part of Africa. And I have been to Africa a few times since, but back then this is a way of connecting. And so it was important to also think about the tool or the kind of method that I had in terms of engaging what was going on in Africa. But back in 1988, when this article was published, lavishly decorated funeral rooms were being presented. And so I was very inspired by this. You can look at the plaids in the background of the room that they're in, and also the kind of brightly colored fabrics on the bed, which signified honor to the family and essentially the kind of indicated a kind of status of the family. So a family that was very wealthy accumulated much textile property, and really it was part of how one said goodbye to one's loved ones. On the bed, there were examples of elaborately folded cloths that inspired my own origami work for this museum and burial ground. So at the time, as an African American, I was reaching to find my relationship to Africa. There wasn't Henry Lewis's Gates, amazing work. And also there was no ancestor.com at the time. So really, you have to, at that time, you had to kind of dig in to what you could find at the library. One of the things that I also struggled with or was really thinking about, and I'm sure many of you as young architects are doing now with technological tools, figuring out how to, work with different programs, but how to communicate with a drawing visually and in this case tactily, because I had really protested the lack of tactility and the lack of other senses in the way in which we construct a drawing. So this was using masking tape in addition to graphite on top of mylar to begin to understand where that burial ground was. So also using ideas of hiding, revealing, covering, smearing out, blacking out, right, with the media itself to understand what was going on with this place. And here you see a site plan. X marks the spot for the African burial ground. It's shown covered in white glass, which was my intervention. And again, using the masking tape and trying to show this kind of covering and laminating that was going on with each new tool that was introduced to understand the place. I didn't want to draw a traditional map, but wanted to undermine the map and all that it implied: territory, accumulation of wealth to certain individuals, which wasn't happening in the African community. Yet I was trained to draw in plan and in section and wanted to show people where this place was. So I struggled with this problem of hypervisibility, and tried to, bring that into the drawing method, as well as deal with a kind of phenomenon of things that were rendered invisible that forced people to fill in more about the story. So this is the site plan. This is the area that was covered by the burial ground. And again, here's a site model with a kind of folded pattern glass that was indicating where the museum and burial ground was to be. The top and this area here is Broadway, and then the top is Duane, and the bottom is Reed Street. Let's see if we can go one more. Oh, we're stuck. There we go. So the details of the glass were generated from the strong directionality of bodies laid in the ground, and African patterning was added on top of that. So you got this lamination cloth, the colorful cloth that I had seen in the African arts article from the library was kind of invented using the idea of white. In other words, the idea that through this kind of media, there was this effort happening, there's this thing happening that changed something that was very colorful to black and white, and also registered the Christian tradition that was happening in this country. I believe the takeaway from this project and research was to understand one's position in the world. And that has really, I would say, been a kind of emphasis in my lab at SOFTLAB. The questions are, who am I? What is this place or stuff in relationship to me? What are appropriate methods to understand what is going on here? It's important to be able to say I and not try to erase oneself. And I believe that is also something that, when you work in science, scientists also grapple with erasure of I from their scientific reports, but that can be problematic. It's been made clear to me many times when writing, especially for computation, that one should not use the pronoun I. However, the abstraction is highly problematic. I've been thinking about bell Hooks's use of the lower case for her name and restoring I to scientific writing. What happens when you deal with the personality in the work is that you begin to open or find other ways of addressing the questions, a lot of which has been missing. So this revised framing was part of how the commission for MoMA was arrived at for the exhibition titled Reconstruction, Blackness in Architecture in America in July 2019. The show was supposed to open in October 20, but got pushed back to February because of the pandemic. There were 3 curators: Sean Anderson, Associate Curator at MoMA, Mabel O. Wilson, Professor of Architecture and Professor of Africana Studies at Columbia University, and Ariel Dion Krosnick at MoMA as curatorial assistant. And this group really changed what normally happens at MoMA. While I was very honored seeing the 3 curators, not only for who they are, but I really appreciated that they were trying to set up a collaborative structure for curating a show in a place that traditionally had one curator for the show. And I was also made more trusting by this kind of risk that these 3 people took in terms of making the show, because MoMA hasn't necessarily, I would say, understood or welcomed Black art. In addition, these 3 assembled an amazing advisory board of Black artists, architects, curators, urban designers who attended a second meeting where there was a conversation and critique of the work that was planned for the exhibition. And artists were issued an incredible reading collection and discussed these readings in a first meeting with the group Practicing Refusal Collective, it's a fantastic name, who are Mabel Wilson, Sadia Hartman, and Tina Camp. At this first meeting, artists presented and discussed potential trajectories of thought in our preambles of work. They talked about refusing to participate in systems of oppression, which made each of us question if we should hold such an exhibition in this institution, which is really about showing its power and shaping a space about art and architecture that was not inclusive or interested in works by people of color. In spite of the known challenges, we as a group of artists felt that it was important to go ahead with the exhibition. And it was really a moment where we put everything on pause and debated, you know, what should we do? Should we just not do this exhibit? I mean, should we just stop because this is absolutely crazy? It's potentially contradictory. But we decided that it was very important to put the work in MoMA, to have a platform to actually say that to a broader audience who might otherwise not necessarily be part of MoMA. And so we decided to honor this incredible multi-voiced, curated opportunity. As an act of refusal, we as a group of artists, architects, and designers formed the Black Reconstruction Collective at our second meeting in November of 2019. And the overarching purpose of our organization is to finish the project of Black emancipation that was started in the Reconstruction era of the United States, but eroded by successive structures put in place by white supremacists. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization here to provide intellectual and monetary support for artists, scholars, designers who are creating new knowledge about design for the African diaspora. And so the point of the BRC was to take the work outside of the museum so that the work went beyond us individuals exhibiting and take the projects into a larger realm. So really that was something that emerged from that first workshop that you saw in the picture. A second point was to produce a space where artists, designers, and others could try things or look at things that may not be looked at because of cautiousness or outright blindness. This is a photo of the bridge in MoMA into the exhibition that shows what we call the BRC manifesting textile that holds the mission statement for the BRC. It covers the name in the gallery at MoMA, the Philip Johnson Gallery. And there was, again, another large debate about Philip Johnson. And it was because he was a Nazi sympathizer and tried to initiate a fascist group in the United States. And so we sat down and thought, how can we put work here that is against this type of activity while that name is still up there? And this was arrived at almost happenstance, but it proved to be something that allowed us to make new ground and clean ground or open ground to receive our works. And again, there was a huge discussion about this with the curators, and then the head curator of MoMA, Glenn Lowery. We met on the 6th of January, actually, as you know, people were storming the Capitol. So we were in there on Zoom having a discussion about whether or not we should cover Philip Johnson's name. And in the meantime, we were getting texts about this insurrection that was happening on the Capitol. So really a kind of odd collision of moments. And this photograph really marks that kind of moment where we're having that discussion. These are the 11 artists participating in the exhibition. I don't know if you can see on the far left-hand side of the wall. Each artist was asked to select a city from the list that was agreed upon by the curatorial team. And refusal happened in a variety of ways in the works presented. And in reflection and analysis of what's on exhibit, I saw a refusal to present anything that fixed or otherwise tried to repair historic acts manifested in the 11 cities. And such acts included the regular toolkit of wiping out Black communities in the US. These tools included the use of highways to cut Black communities off from larger segments of the city, to use eminent domain to declare Black neighborhoods as in poor repair, and to seize the land for other purposes, redlining, etc. Right. So I think we're all familiar with some of these. Rather, what I saw in the exhibit was a reimagining of what could be, an imagining of what was good about Blackness. What I saw was a potential for making dreams, a new space emergent in architecture. And what I saw was a refusal that made, it made possible a space for dreaming. So each artist was asked to select a city in the United States. I selected Pittsburgh because I'd recently moved to Pennsylvania and wanted to know more about Pittsburgh. I'd done a little bit of work there before with the August Wilson Center and making its kind of primary, its opening exhibition there with another architect located in Pittsburgh. But I chose the Hill District to begin to understand what the story was there. And I did a lot of research, which you can see in this video. I'm going to show you a video in a second, which was made in response to the Black Reconstruction Collective's question, what is Black reparations? It's one of a triptych of videos about stories in Pittsburgh, and particularly the Hill District. So there are two parts, and I'm going to let you watch the video first, and then we'll go ahead. Let's see if we can get that. Hi, sorry to interrupt. I hear there's no sound on the video. Is there a way to get the sound? Let's see.
Felicia, there are some suggestions in the chat Do you see them to get your sound working?
Ah, okay. Oh, I have to,
Oh, I see the sound thing in the end on the right. Do you see that? Completely to the right is a teeny tiny little something.
okay.
If you go over the screen with your mouse over the movie.
Is that it? Oh, no.
Mm.
I think I may have to
In the
exit
bar,
out.
you see in the bar, if you see in the bar,
Yeah,
in the bar there.
it doesn't play because I think it needs to be checked maybe on Zoom, and I don't know if I did that. So I'm gonna just share my screen again.
Oh,
Bear
perfect.
with me, everyone. And it's going to ask me if I want to do something with the video. Okay. Oh, it didn't come up. It should reshare. Let's try again. I actually think I have to stop sharing. Why don't we continue on without the music, because I think I have to go all the way out
Totally fine.
from it. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. And I'm going to skip it to the end. Okay, so I'm sorry you didn't get to hear the sound, but you can find that video online at the BRC Black Reconstruction Collective.org under Dreams of Reparations, so that you can hear the sound and music to that. There are essentially two parts that make up the work that was commissioned by MoMA. The first is transmissions, which is a quilt, and it connects to the Hill District in Pittsburgh, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And the quilt tells stories about the district. It's meant to travel outside the museum to reach beyond the walls of the gallery. And the second part is called receptions part. And this is a fabric antenna that stayed within the gallery of the museum. So you can see here the quilt. The idea of the quilt was, I would say we did it as a way to start our basic research. In addition to the video that you just saw, it was a way that we were able to collect what we learned, this kind of story, main storyline, and there are many other stories that intersected that main storyline through the archival work that we were doing at the Carnegie Museum of Art in the Heinz History Center. And the quilt was, I would say, a kind of activity that you could find in many households, and we were interested in connecting with people and their stories through this. The quilt is not intended as the architecture of the project, but certainly presented as a method of questioning. And as such, is a method of questioning as part of architecture, also constructs the space around the making of the architecture. And so I always see the kind of relationship that you make these things and people, oh, that's not architecture. But in fact, in terms of constructing space for conversation and a space to connect with people, they might be seen as such. So this quilt was made as a computational textile and points to those experiences and skills with sewing, working with soft materials, and brings them into architecture. It's a method and operates as material, a metaphor, or heuristic device for thinking about operations and concepts in making architecture. And for us in studio, you know, the gaps in between the images, the orders of the images, the gaps in between the panels allowed us to understand a bit more about what was going on in the photos and what this meant to us. Sewing the panels down closed circuits behind the quilt and was a kind of another phase of this quilt. And we're still intrigued with how ordering can remake and help us understand other aspects of the stories. One of my graduate students played with this problem of scrambling the parts in another project to close a circuit, which I'll show you in a few minutes. So the quilt starts a conversation with people about making, and as a repository of history, when touched, the copper in each panel activates a speaker that tells a story about what happens in the panel. We'd like to take this quilt on the road to the Hill District and continue to hear and make new stories with the residents on the Hill. So it's meant to be our emotional connecting and networking material. This was interrupted, of course, by COVID. But one of the things that I would say we've learned by making this and kind of had the opportunity to think through in the kind of pause is that the softness in this material system is how we define the concept of construction of the communication, which is collaborative and incrementally built in this project, and something that kind of characteristic that we wanted to have in our architecture. The lily pad at the bottom of the quilt was designed by Leah Beakley, a designer and computer scientist at University of New Mexico. I'm going to go back and show you that. It's at the bottom of this slide, and permits fashioning of do-it-yourself work. This is supported by a network of online tutorials and programs. And this network is also part of what we understand to be the material. For many of the works that we do, the ability to access and use these inexpensive do-it-yourself components is the difference between connecting with people or not. So in terms of thinking about openness and softness, an example of quilt making craft can be seen in this project by my PhD graduate student, Farzana Aghazian, which was developed for her coursework in fiber composites. Farzana calls this the circuit game, and it looked to teach young children how to close a circuit using pieces that were connected with conductive copper ripstop nylon and stainless steel coated fabrics. And the idea is to close a circuit and light up an LED by tying groups of these pieces together. And you can find this work published in the proceeds for distributed, ambient, and pervasive computing. These are some of the combinations of the pieces which are made from felt, carbon fiber, knitted pieces, scraps of things that we had in SOFTLAB. And she tried out various connections and ways to allow the pieces to plug and play. So I think this technique, and we've been talking about it, can potentially work for the quilt to allow for many different ways of telling stories so that we can take the pieces of the quilt and allow people to re-scramble them and tell another story about them. So we can change what connects to what. In my lab, when we think about material, you know, a computational textile changes the idea of a material to one that's expansive. If you think about it, a material might be seen like in the above image, where a designer is weaving together a person or body, a body monitor such as a heart monitor, a mobile phone, a laptop, a set of responsive yarns and fabrics, a power system, and the environment. So this drawing shows one example of a textile material system, a computational textile material system. But there could be many others. For example, if we take the Fabricating Networks quilt that was made for MoMA, that one might have potentially many other people joined together and connected in different spaces. So we think that to our eyes, this idea of material and kind of construction of space is in fact larger than what we can see in simply looking at the kind of stuff of material of building alone. So if materials change us as we change them, as Tim Ingold and J.J. Gibson and many others argue, how are these materials changing our bodies and how we live day-to-day life and how we think about living? Maybe we can return to some of these questions at the end of the lecture. So here's a detail of that quilt showing a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab at Penn State. The lab is a way of foregrounding the making experiences that many of us had as children and still have working with soft materials. And these materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both the scale of the body to the scale of the building, because we often start by making things like clothing and then move up to very large scales of architecture. But working this way automatically returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you are building for, but a particular body, particular bodies. And for this direction, for this reason, we're looking at two different directions of research in our lab. The first direction is more architecturally traditional, where we look at using textiles for sheltering. These are projects like tents, shade structures, etc. Those are kind of easily understood. A second direction is looking at the human body in space and trying to understand the potentials for rethinking what architecture could be by understanding the augmented and sensing body in its environment. And these projects are materials that you wear on your body and use the body as part of its system. A scene like you see in this quilt panel was a very familiar scene to me growing up, and I felt that many of the things that I have been thinking about came from this well of knowledge in these kind of learning situations that I had. And that interest was seated inside at our dining table, typically in the summers, with my aunt, my mother, my sister, who would be my aunt who would be visiting from Chicago. My aunt took fashion courses in the evening after her shift as a registered nurse. And we always, as children, had the most beautifully crafted, fashionable clothing because of my Aunt Ruth. And although my family never wanted for anything, we made many of our own clothes. And that's how we sort of got in touch with each other, became in touch with each other. It was a space that we had to talk, find out the gossip, find out, what needed to be done in our family. So it was an important time in the summer, making clothes together. That clothing and the making of elegance, via how you carried yourself and what you wore, was a way to transport you to someplace else, to fight back, to take on other identities, understand the world in a different way, and most importantly, dream. The image shows 1100 Wiley Avenue in the Hill District, Pittsburgh, and this is undergirded by the photograph of Teenie Harris, a Black photographer who took pictures of everyday Black life in the Hill District and other Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. So all the pictures that you've been looking at are from the Teenie Harris archive in Pittsburgh. This particular one calls out the highway and tells a story of the I-579 that crosses at the bottom of the Hill District. That was part of forming the national highway infrastructure laid across cities in the 1950s and 1960s. For Pittsburghers, the problem now is how to make infrastructure to connect across the highway, to connect across to the downtown, which is now really growing and expanding, and has for a long time separated Black Pittsburgh from kind of downtown. So this is a new project that's ongoing. Actually, Big has been commissioned to do it, and some other local architects join forces with them. I'm not totally sure what's going on with that now, but essentially this is the kind of big mission now, is just reconnecting. At the time, once they kind of cleared the area, they were making space for this piece, which is the Civic Center. It's this kind of dome-like piece that goes up, which is here. And really, afterwards, as you saw in the video, everything got taken down again in 2012 because the whole area was dangerous and not working and empty. So it didn't work as projected. And now they're talking about doing something else in Pittsburgh. This particular site in Pittsburgh is now what is called Freedom Corner. It started out as the edge, the kind of bottom edge of all that area that was subtracted away that you saw in the video, and also in that photograph with the highways at the bottom. And they took over a billboard and began placing signs there to that sign faces downtown, to basically make their point known, that no development beyond this point, and really that housing that was affordable was needed in the area. This later became Freedom Corner, and it was a place where people assembled to protest, to march in the late 60s into the 70s. And it is honorifically noted today. It's got a beautiful kind of brick paving pattern and a sculpture in the middle of it, as well as a quote that is really marks that place in that neighborhood. So the reception part of the project for MoMA is what I call the flower antenna, and it's located in the museum. And the black flower antenna speaks to those invisible networks formed by electromagnetic waves that we all grapple with in terms of liberation. And this project really makes use of what I will say is something that a media that is primarily invisible, that we are surrounded by. Like, we can't see electromagnetic waves, but they're all around us. And they are shaping spaces as we speak, as we sit here listening to this lecture, and something to consider. We started out by doing architectural drawings to understand this place in Pittsburgh. But again, the purpose here was not necessarily to put something on the site. Really, it was to look respectfully, and again, not to fix anything or to provide a solution to a problem, but rather to see what was there. And the antenna was a reaction about not putting something on the site, which was so hotly contested by local Pittsburghers. The Penguins, which is a hockey company, a hockey team, their management had made a deal to develop this area. And as I mentioned, Big had done a proposal for this entire site, beautiful renderings, etc. However, after pushback from local leaders and community leaders in their community design centers, that was stopped, and now they're working on something else. And hopefully it's a more of a conversation, but that remains to be seen. We'll see what happens there over the next, decade, in fact. So the last research video called Upon a Time, which was shown in December, really listed the efforts of all the people in this community, what they had done over the years, starting in the late 60s when they had built a kind of community design center, listed all the different projects that were happening. So I didn't feel I needed to add my 2 cents, from the position of this museum to Pittsburgh. I think they've got plenty of talent and energy and smarts from that place itself. So really, I would say the project that we worked on was pointing towards something to think about. These drawings became more about making something that's invisible understood and something that was ephemeral understood. This drawing is called A Scene of Fabrication, and the title is taken from Saidiya Hartman's Scene of Subjugation. So really positing something that was about making something positive, about a dreaming space in the museum, and sort of turning on Saidiya's title. So the drawings really focus as an idea of dreaming. And you can see, if you look closely below, there are scans of lace and other fabrics that's overlaid on top of the map of Pittsburgh that is used to really make a kind of new ground again with textile. So I wanted to present something that was under construction. The reception part of the project is what I call the Black Flower Antenna, as I mentioned, and it's located in a museum. And it's a symbolic structure, a receiving wideband antenna. It's made up of 34 industrially knitted cones that are embedded with pink copper yarns that transmit the presence of electromagnetic waves via high-pitched live sounds in this gallery. So the black flower serves to make visible and present the workings of an invisible urbanism that floats above the physical city, supported and constructed by electromagnetic waves. And so these invisible waves that surround us even now are part of a new global ocean, making it possible for us to connect through the internet. However, traversing this ocean in our everyday practices is as perilous as the Atlantic crossing or the Middle Passage. So the black flowers are a reminder of this other invisible space that interconnects with the architecture that we're inhabiting, the kind of hardcore brick walls, the hardcore floors. It reminds us about this other invisible space that's being constructed and needs attention for a more life valuing future. The pink underbelly of the antenna shows embedded copper and poly yarn, which is what permits the collection of the invisible electromagnetic waves in the gallery. And the form of the flower was selected to give us an opportunity to study a gradient of parametrically sized cones. And these were drawn in Kangaroo and Kiwi 3D and simulated. We simulated the shapes to see if we could actually predict these shapes by using this kind of knitted fabric, because we had specified a piece of a certain size to MoMA, and knits are famously kind of unruly and not wanting to end up in the shape that you want them to be. So we were also investigating algorithms. This is my PhD student looking at algorithms to make sure that we could put in a material and see if we could predict the shape of these things. So what we were trying to do is get the continuum from digital drawing through to the material, so that what we saw in the digital drawing could end up in the actual physical drawing. And this has been published, at least part of it. There are other pieces coming, as a paper called A Simulation Process for Architectural Knitted Textiles at the International Association for Shell and Spatial Structures. And we also have been using machine learning as part of our way to think about predicting the shapes. I have a video that shares with you the sound. It's a rather shocking sound that is emitted from the piece. Whoops, let's see if I can get it to roll. Actually, we won't have sound, so I'll skip that because it won't play. So the pink copper yarn really worked to help stabilize the piece in terms of the algorithms and in the materials that we're using, because as you know, metal does not stretch that much unless you heat it up. And so it was a way to simplify our work, and we were under a lot of pressure to get this done on time, and we're sitting there experimenting with our algorithm. It doesn't work. Then finally we added some more copper yarn and got it to work. So there were many steps in terms of how we made this project and in the making of the cones. And just to go over a few, I would say the biggest challenge that we had, as mentioned, was getting the size right, getting gauge, predicting how many stitches for how large a piece and how much tension. And what we handed to the knitter is in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. It has a series of pockets that allow kind of compression structure to be slipped inside it, so it works as one. The knitter, who is fantastic, took this pattern and translated that into a Shimaseki whole garment machine, which meant that this piece was being knitted all at once as a tube. And then below, you can see what was sent back to us, a knit underneath what we used to stretch it out, compression rings, which we bent using a wire bender. And then we slipped the compression system in. In addition, we worked with Erin Lewis of the Swedish School of Textiles, who has been working with amazing textile antennas. And she helped us with the board that you can see here in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. So while we were able to get a grip on the predictability, one of the, I would say, foremost pleasures of working with knits is their unpredictability. And so we're always torn about what we find and what we end up with in the final shape of the knit, but know that sometimes, you know, as an architect, you need to get the thing done and get it shaped properly and deliver it on time. So definitely our algorithm will be useful for future projects and useful to other architects. So what we are trying to do, what we tried to do with this project was address both our kind of scientific look at, figuring out computational tools and designs that we could use to make more soft architectures, as well as to use these tools and this type of computational fabric to connect with people emotionally, to register their presence, and to provoke questions about the order in our society. So we think about softness as a powerful quality to imagine reconstruction. And with that, I am going to stop and take questions from the floor. We're at 7:30, so I'm going to stop and hopefully rejoin everyone.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I love that installation. How gorgeous.
Thank you. Thank you. We had a lot, it was a pleasure making it and working with it in spite of the crazy timeline, pressured timeline. But I guess architects are used to that.
Yeah, exactly. Our typical state of being.
Yes.
We are joined by Eduardo Rega and Simon. If you like to join, just hop in.
Hi, Simon.
Simon is saying hi to you.
I see your note there. Hello.
And Eduardo Rega just joined us as well.
Hello. Thank you
Hi.
for the amazing lecture, Felecia. It's a big
Hi.
pleasure to meet you like this.
Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I can start it. What I loved about your work when I was looking into it is that you're calling it SOFTLAB, but I mean, the power of these installations is incredible, you know, and it's interesting because you're using soft materials, but it's a huge intensity, and I'm definitely going to see the black one to hear the sound.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
No, it actually didn't need it, but you know, it's actually now we have to go, right? Discover it. Yeah, but it's really interesting. So talking about soft and intense, no, it's like really, it's a soft material, but the effect or the affect, as Peter would say, is like incredibly intense and very I can imagine that people really want to touch it, you know, it's very tactile. Do you have problems with that that people try and like grab your installations?
Yeah, the guards in the museum were pretty protective of the pieces. But I think in this particular exhibition, a lot of the staff there were people of color, and they took on a certain amount of pride. They were actually, guiding people and explaining to people what was going on. So they were really knowledgeable about the works. I can totally relate to people wanting to touch things, especially textiles. And that is one of the reasons why we made the quilt to go outside the gallery, because you do want to tell a story through what you can feel and what you can interact with.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to also get away from the idea of the kind of sculptural thing that you couldn't touch. And they actually, with the sculptural, with the black flower, they wouldn't even let you walk underneath it, which I was really looking forward to, because I envisioned kids running underneath it and sitting underneath there like in the drawings. And that wasn't possible, but certainly I'm looking forward to taking the quilt out and working with people on that and making the rest of the space that belongs to this project.
Yeah.
I was interested in the final loop, Felecia. Did the people who recorded for you and who helped make the quilt, did they go to see the piece in the museum? And how did they respond to that?
Actually, the people, well, when we made the quilt, it was the middle of COVID. So we didn't make it with other people. We made, I would say, 9 panels in our lab, working socially distanced, as a seed that we could then take with us out into different clubs and different community groups in the Hill District to work with other people. And the intention is to have people bring their own photographs of their neighborhood and to record their own stories. So Teenie Harris is a photographer in Pittsburgh that most residents know at this point. They're very familiar with his photographs and they've seen his work. And so it's a way to get them started and to see how they can contribute to that as an idea, to that as an archive.
Mhm. It's just fascinating. I saw the piece at MoMA, and yeah, I really wanted to touch it. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been working in similar neighborhoods here in Philadelphia in some of our studios, and I don't know if you are familiar with a neighborhood called Black Bottom, which basically sits on the land that the University of Pennsylvania sits on. And the same kind of story, this kind of destruction of the houses, but most of all the culture, right? Which is a very, very vibrant arts culture. So it continues to provide ground for all kinds of rethinking of how to memorialize, how to record, how to archive for the people that were displaced. It's a sort of black mark on the kind of reputation of Penn. Yeah.
I think Penn is not alone. I mean, we're across the United States. This is a repeating problem, right? Or a repeating event that happened. I'm sitting at Penn State right now, which was the home of the Lanai people. I think there are indigenous people also that lived in Philadelphia. That's a different branch of the same Indian tribe, but also the Susquehanna. There are whole maybe 5 or 6 indigenous groups that lived in this area that is now Penn State and the land in which my house sits on. So yeah, it's a story. It's a story that I think the United States is going to reckon with, and that in architecture, definitely it moves to the foreground because, what do? Today I did not give my land statement, but I could. I had recently talked to some indigenous people, and they were like, well, these statements become these performances, but we've had enough of that. And now what? So now what? So I didn't read it because I literally this week was that conversation. And so as an architect, I'm like, yeah, no, what is the next step? What should there be a kind of gathering together and a discussion of this? How do we acknowledge this? What's the right way? How do we deal with trauma? So all these questions emerge now.
Yeah. Questions that bother us all. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Felecia. I was very, I really loved your lecture, and I think it's an incredible contribution to our school and to the conversations that our students are having, and us as a collective. While you were presenting, I was going back. I'm sorry if this is all disconnected. I was taking notes during the conversation or during the presentation, and so it might look a little disconnected and maybe long. I hope it ends up making some sense. So excuse me. But I was constantly remembering like an anecdote that happened to me in the park with my daughter the other day, which is a 3-year-old kid asked me, what would you do in an invisible cloak? And he stared at me for like 5 seconds, and I was shocked. I looked back and I didn't have an answer, and then he left. No? And so I was thinking about this question during your presentation, and so I was thinking that what do you do with an invisible cloak? And maybe what you have been doing is one of what you do with your work is in a way what you do under an invisible cloak, no? Which is in a way practicing refusal while not being crushed by by the institutions, becoming invisible as one operates within institutions in order to render our various struggles visible. Also the invisible cloak with the kilt and with all of the work with soft materials and so on and so forth. No? Also becoming invisible to erode forms of institutionalized violence, become invisible to move beyond the institutions, to refuse their violences and to open up, to dream differently, like you showed us today. Become invisible in order to make visible the ways in which institutions limit what's possible and limit our dreams. Become invisible to inhabit institutionalized gaps or institutional gaps and blind spots. And so maybe the projects like the ones that you presented, I think are ways in which, you know, you have revealed the histories of violence, but also histories of resistance and of refusal of life, despite those institutionalized violences. So these projects like the kilts and so on are what you do with the invisible cloak, I think. So I wonder, now, how do you produce that invisibility cloak? What are the tools? What are the strategies? What are the collaborations? What are the alliances? What are the archives? The tactics outside of institutions, within institutions, or within their cracks that allow you to refuse them and dream and rehearse futures beyond them while existing within them. So, of course, this will be like a bit revealing the magic trick. But I think it would be very helpful for all of us. I think, and those of us like me, I'm currently facilitating a course called Rebellious Architecture with a number of incredible students at the core level, and a studio also on, on post-PMA futures of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which also learns a lot from the work of Sadiya Hartman and of Fred Moten and of the Strike MoMA collaborative. And you having been in MoMA and having refused MoMA from within. Anyway, sorry that I should give more space also to others and to your answer. So, how do you construct your invisibility cloak?
Wow, amazing question, and thank you for the beautiful and poetic invisibility cloak. I love that. Giving me something to really gnaw on and to think about. Yeah, thank you for this beautiful question, Eduardo. It will have me thinking for a while, but let's see if I can give just on the top of my head, just talk about some of the things, the issues that you raise here. One of them is, this idea of invisibility. Sometimes, if we look to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, in that case, the invisibility actually angers and enrages, right? And I think people, and it's always in that case in juxtaposition to a dominant culture, something that is not seeing you. But I would say that to be direct about answering your question, maybe the formation of the Black Reconstruction Collective has helped make the invisibility cloak. In other words, has helped having conversations with other scholars who are interested in the Black diaspora to make a place to dream. In other words, not necessarily to see things always in juxtaposition or the negative of the kind of dominant culture, but rather, if that wasn't there, what would you actually do? Like, this is your question. If you had the invisibility cloak, what would you do? And that's the space of dreaming, right? And so I think that the Black Reconstruction is one of the methods, this kind of gathering and talking and arguing, a lot of arguing, positioning of people on different topics is one of them. And also coming to terms with, and I don't think this will ever be done, coming to terms with the tools that I was given as an architect, right? You're taught how to draw an orthographic drawings, which come from surveying and dividing and how do you say, kind of segmenting things, right? This is one thing that's also part of computation, where segmentation is huge, right? In terms of how we understand computation. How do you take something apart? How can you then use it and put it together and deploy it in another way? That's part of computation. So I think, figuring out methods that both use and also undermine those is like a lifelong project, at least for the rest of my life that I'll be here. So I have no answer to the magic method, but certainly having the space to dream about those questions is probably one of the most important things to start. Otherwise, you're constantly just battling, and the battle is we've done the battle. It's boring, right? It's like that's enough of that. So yeah, thank you for this question. Really beautiful question.
Hi,
Thank you
Felecia.
so
It's
much.
Simon.
Hey,
Hey, it's great to see you. Beautiful work, as always.
thank you.
And speaking about the work that you're doing with new media, new communication, and certainly the computation, I agree fully that there is a kind of a parsing of the world, especially for object-oriented languages. When you worked with your the flower and you were talking about predictability, for me, I just had to have like a commiserating chuckle as to what you want to do, what actually happens, and then what you have to accept as designer when you are working with new communication, and especially for the refusal of the erasure of I. In interactive work, which oftentimes is an inclusive work where you're not just you, but you're also accepting the narratives of others. And is there a kind of, I guess, a starting point that you have as a metric for success? When I'm thinking back, like, how you can register happiness in the piece Behind a Net, for example.
Yeah, great question, Simon. So that was something I grappled with in my dissertation. And in one way, by flying in the face of trying to read emotion, I kind of landed in this problem of computation, which is that computation wants to define things so that they can quantify it, so that it can be then digested by a computer or ... right? So you can mechanize things. And so by dealing with emotion, it kind of jammed two things that potentially didn't want to be jammed together, and was really helpful to me in terms of understanding what deeply was going on with computation. So the takeaway from the piece Behind Net is that you can, to some extent, as a designer, understand emotions that people might take from textures. Like, there's certain things that keep happening over and over again if you show people pictures. So given the context, if you show people pictures, you might get some kind of alignment. But as soon as you allow someone to walk around a piece and touch it and like turn their head and do whatnot, then all hell breaks loose and you have different communications happening. And we're all in different bodies. And so the more that you give people back their bodies, the less agreement you have in terms of this idea of segmentation. So this is the quandary that one has with computation. And I would say, just as a designer, that one can choose to be cognizant of that and accept it and understand where you're going to have those boundaries with computation, and other times not accept it. So it's both, I guess it's both accepting what it can do and then understanding where it's going to totally trash your, what you're doing. So it does, I think it does it's very useful to have computational methods to use as an architect. They save a lot of time. There are many, many important things that these tools do, but on the other hand, one has to also question like what in fact is actually going on in the background and what is lost.
Fantastic, thanks. Yeah, certainly things to continually discuss the next time I see you.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be soon. Yeah.
Sure.
I actually see here that there is a book out on your show. Is that the book on the MoMA show? Yeah,
that is, I think that's called, yeah, it's the title of the show, Reconstructions, Blackness, Architecture and Blackness in America. Has a lot of really great essays if people are interested in understanding just the kind of operational events that happened in architecture around Blackness in many different cities. And I think that's one of its usefulness, is that one begins to see certain stories repeating and happening again and again, and can begin to speculate on ways of dealing with that, or ways of thinking about that, ways of dreaming beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask if students out there had any questions. They're very silent out there. No? Okay, go ahead, Rika.
No, I was just going to ask actually whether you had any other questions, or otherwise I know our sponsor is waiting for Felecia. So that was my question. And also the invitation for all of you to join to the sponsor in our next meeting. So maybe we continue the discussion there. I think that might be actually very nice, because I'm sure they're dying to hear from you. Yeah,
That'd be fine. Yeah.
Can we do that? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. That would be fine.
Thank you.